Today we're going to take a little break from our binaural microphones, and I'm going to get some studying done. We're studying how to master audio. This is how I've learned how to fine-tune my audio. Currently, I'm on I'm on chapter 10. Dynamics, part 2. A release decay control allows more flexibility in painting the sound character. Very few compressors provide this facility, but it is useful when we want to retain more of the natural sound of the instrument, and not exaggerate its sustain when the signal instantly goes soft, or reduce quote-unquote breathing or hissing effects when the source is noisy. The distortion shown here is caused by the compressor's action being so fast that it follows the shape of the low-frequency waveform rather than the overall envelope of the music. This problem can occur with release times shorter than about 50 milliseconds and correspondingly short attack times. Microdynamic manipulation, adjusting the impact of music with a downward compressor. The engineer as artist. Compressors, expanders, and limiters form the foundation of modern-day recording, mixing, and mastering. With the right device, we can make a recording sound more or less percussive, more or less punchy, bouncy, simply good or bad, mediocre or excellent. Used in skilled hands, compression produces wonderful recordings. A skilled engineer may intentionally use creative compression to paint a sound and form new special effects. And a lot of contemporary music genres are based on the sound of compression, both in mixing and mastering, from disco to rap to heavy metal. The keywords here, though, are intent and skill. Surprisingly, however, some engineers/artists don't know what uncompressed, natural-sounding audio sounds like. While more and more music is created in the studio control room, it's good to learn how to capture natural sound before moving into the abstract. Picasso was a creative genius, but he approached his art systematically, first mastering the natural plastic arts before moving into his cubist period. Similarly, it's good practice to know the real sound of... I haven't had to take any notes yet. These things are good to know for me, but some are more worthy of note-taking than others. Similarly, it's good practice to know the real sound of instruments. Recording a well-balanced group in a good acoustic space with just 2 mics is a lot of work, but also a lot of fun. Before multitracking was invented, there was much less need for compression, because close miking exaggerates the natural dynamics of instruments and vocals. At first, compressors were used to control those instruments whose dynamics were severely altered by close miking, e.g., vocals and acoustic bass. When modern music began to emphasize rhythm, many instruments began to get masked by the rhythmic energy, inspiring the creative possibilities of compressors and a totally new style of recording and mixing. The advent of the SSL console with a compressor on every individual channel changed the sound of recorded music forever. compression and limiting in mastering. Mastering requires us to develop new skills since it is concerned with overall mixes rather than individual instruments. Compression is a tool which can change the inner dynamics of music, e.g., beef up low and mid-level passages, enhance rhythmic movement, or make a stronger musical message. But limiters generally change sound very little, simply enable it to be louder. That's why they are used more often in mastering than in mixing. Even the best limiter is not perfectly inaudible, softening the transients and even fattening the sound slightly. BBC research in the 1940s demonstrated that distortion shorter than about 6 to 10 milliseconds is fairly inaudible. Hence, the 6 millisecond integration time of the BBC ppm meter. But this result reflected also the then current state of technology. With digital recording and solid-state equipment, some transient distortion as short as 1 millisecond would audibly change the sound of the initial transient, particularly for acoustic piano. With good equipment and mastering technique, program material with a peak-to-average ratio of 18 to 20 decibels can often be reduced to about 14 decibels, with little effect on the clarity of the sound, but some reduction in transient impact. That's one of the reasons 30 IPS analog tape is so desirable. It has this limiting function built in. A rule of thumb is that short duration, or a few milliseconds, transients of unprocessed digital sources can often be transparently reduced by 2 decibels. In rare cases, as much as 6 decibels, with little effect on the sound. At this point, I go over the material I've covered and check to see if I require any notation. However, this cannot be done with analog tape sources, which have already lost the short duration transients. Any further transient reduction by compression or limiting, whatever its desirability, will not be transparent. Limiter distortion is especially audible on material which already has little peak information because a limiter is not designed to work on the RMS portion of the music, and it can sound harsh when pushed. So the less limiting, the more snappy the sound. In an ideal mastering session, if a limiter is used at all, it should only be acting on occasional inaudible peaks, or perhaps a bit more if we like the slight fattening effect. A manual for a certain digital limiter reads, quote, "For best results, start out with a threshold of -6 dBFS, or decibels full scale." This is like saying, always put a teaspoon of salt and pepper on your food before tasting it. One modern R&B album is so over-limited that the bass drum punches a hole in the vocal on every track. I doubt this is artistically desirable. It is a common misconception that a limiter is a peak protection device for mastering. It may be used as such in radio broadcasting to protect the transmitter, or sound reinforcement to protect loudspeakers. But in mastering or mixing, the engineer has total control over his levels and makes the choice whether to turn them down or raise them and use a peak limiter. The world's most transparent digital limiter. The most transparent limiter is to use no limiter at all. If there is a very short peak, transient overload, for example, a drum beat within a section which needs to be made louder, a skilled mastering engineer can use the DAW's editor to perform a short duration gain drop. It can be quite inaudible. This manual limiting technique allows us to raise a song's apparent loudness without inducing distortion from a digital limiter. So it is the first process to consider when working with open-sounding music that can be ruined by too much processing. We can often get away with 1 to 3 decibel manual limiting, typically for a duration of less than 3 milliseconds. But longer duration manual drops will affect the sound as much as or more than a good digital limiter. Equal loudness comparisons. Since loudness has such an effect on judgment, it is very important to make comparisons at equal apparent loudness. If played louder during an instant A-B comparison, the processed version may initially seem to sound better, but long-term listeners prefer a less fatiguing sound, which, quote, breathes. When we compare at matched loudness, we may be surprised to discover that the processing is making the sound worse, and the improvement was an illusion. When making an album at, quote, competitive loudness level, it's a relief if the mastering has not degraded the sound of the program, and ecstasy if it has improved it. The nitty-gritty, compression in music mastering. Consider this rhythmic passage, representing a piece of modern pop music. Shooby-dooby-doo-wop. Shooby-dooby-doo-wop. Shooby-dooby-doo. Wop. The accent point in this rhythm comes on the backbeat, wop, often a snare drum hit. If we strongly compress this piece, it might change to, well, I won't be reading this, but it's the same thing I just read, only in all caps. This completely removes the accented feel from the music, which is probably counterproductive. A light amount of compression might accomplish this. Shooby-dooby-doo-wop, shooby-dooby-doo-wop, etc. Which could just be what the doctor ordered for this music, as strengthening the sub-accents may give the music more interest, unless we're trying for a special effect or purposely creating an unnatural sound. It's counterproductive to go against the natural dynamics of music. Like the TV weather persons who put an accent on the wrong syllable because they've been taught to punch every sentence. Quote, the weather for tomorrow will be cloudy. Much hip-hop music, for example, is intentionally unnatural. Anything goes, including the eradication of any resemblance to the attacks and decays of real musical instruments. One way to start compressing in order to help obtain punch or attitude is first to find the threshold, using a very high ratio, say 4:1, and very fast release time, say 100 milliseconds. Then to adjust the threshold until the gain reduction meter bounces as the syllables you want to affect pass by and you hear this bounce. This ensures that the threshold is optimally placed around the musical accents you want to manipulate, the, quote, action point of the music. Then reduce the bass ratio to very low, say 1.2:1, and raise the release time to about 250 milliseconds to start. From then on, it's a matter of fine-tuning attack, release, and ratio, with possibly a readjustment of the threshold. The object is to push the threshold in between the lower and higher dynamics, creating a constant alternation between high and low, or no, compression within the music. Don't get fooled by your eyes. Since many compressors' meters are too slow, they go into gain reduction before the meters move, so 1 decibel of meter gain reduction can mean a lot. Note that too low a threshold will defeat the purpose, which is to differentiate the syllables of the music. With too low a threshold, everything will be brought up to a constant level. Typical ratios and thresholds. When working on microdynamics in the above fashion, compression ratios most commonly used in mastering are from about 1.5 to 1 through 3.3 to 1, and typical thresholds in the -20 to -10 dBFS range. Just a moment. These are good things for me to know. Therefore, I will note them. Oops, that mess looked like a 5. But there is no rule, it continues. When engineers get great results with ratios of 5 to 1, whereas a delicate painting might require a ratio as small as 1.01 to 1, or a threshold of -3 dBFS. One trick to compress as inaudibly as possible is to use an extremely light ratio, say 1.01 to 1.1, and a very low threshold, perhaps as low as -30 or -40 dBFS, starting well below where the action is. In this case, the compressor is not bouncing on the syllables, but rather giving a gentle, continuous form of macrodynamic reduction. We may choose a low ratio to lightly control a recording that's too jumpy, or to give a recording some needed body. It's unusual to see such low ratios in tracking and mixing, but very common in mastering. Partly because with full program material, larger ratios may create breathing, pumping, or other artifacts. Compressors with unique characteristics. Part of the fun in discovering the specialties of different compressors. Even with the same settings, some are smooth, some punchy. Some nicely fatten the sound, and others make it brighter, harder, or more percussive. This is often due to differences in the curve or acceleration of the time constants, how the device recovers from gain reduction, whether the gain returns to unity on a linear, logarithmic, or even an irregular curve. Analog compressor designers choose from several styles of gain manipulation. The most common are optical, abbreviated opto, VCA, voltage controlled amplifier, Varimu, PWM, pulse width modulation, in other words, and their various subcategories. Digital designers may emulate their characteristics, as in the Waves Renaissance series of digital compressors, which have both opto and electro modes. In opto position, the release time slows down for the last portion of the release, while in electro it accelerates. Electro can yield a more aggressive sound, while opto is good for gentle, easygoing purposes. Analog optical compressors are great on vocals in tracking or mixing. Not as good for aggressive mastering of overall program material, because they are generally too slow. However, digital opto models can be faster than their analog counterparts. Another feature is to add supplementary low-frequency harmonics to change tonality, as in Waves' quote, warm setting of the Renaissance compressor. Note that the addition of harmonics slightly compresses sound by reducing the peak to average ratio. While generally analog optical models are more suitable for gentle mastering, one model, the Pendulum OCL-2, has a proprietary optical sensor whose reaction time is much faster than others on the market, as well as a very transparent tube circuit which can provide very subtle warming. This makes the OCL-2 perhaps the only optical analog compressor with the gentleness of optical, useful for adding body, but also capable of providing a bit of punch. However, it is not as fast as a VCA or PWM-based compressor, which may be necessary to help achieve attitude or punch in rock and roll. In my opinion, closest to a Swiss Army knife is the Crane Song Tracker with 2 Ks, a solid-state compressor which can emulate the tonality and speed characteristics of several different types of compressors and embody some of the warming characteristics associated with tubes. The only downside of the tracker is the learning curve. The best way to learn is to experiment with each of the presets. Another style of compressor is the Manley Veramu, whose ratio varies with dynamics, but its action may be a bit slow for music with fairly fast dynamics. Well, I think that's enough for today. I really wanted to get a feel for this setup with my shotgun microphone to capture extra depth for you. Thank you for joining me. Until next time, this is Caesar.